Good afternoon, everybody. I'm super pleased to be here. My name's Gary Schwartz. I'll be hosting today's session, and I am thrilled to be joined by two incredible gentlemen. Our co-founder and CEO, Thomas Pace of NetRise, and Allan Friedman, former senior advisor and strategist for CISA. And Allan is the godfather of the SBOM, and that's going to drive the conversation today. So, gentlemen, welcome to our inaugural LinkedIn Live.
Great to be here.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, it's super great to have you. And Allan, I'm just going to start. We'll talk a little bit about the history of the SBOM. You moved to CISA from NTIA in July 21, and then as I was researching, I saw the executive order and where the initial minimum requirements for the SBOM came from, and it seems to follow your career trajectory. Can you give us a little history of that and kind of what your mission and thinking is for that?
Sure. So first, I always like to say I did not invent the idea of SBOM. I was just the loudest and most insistent person on it, right? The idea had been around for a while. It actually goes back to sort of the early days of agile software development and DevOps, where software people looked at heavy industry and said, we're doing all this complex waterfall method. Let's use techniques from heavy industry, which includes a focus on supply chain. And so people have been talking about that for a while. People paying attention to open source licensing had said, gosh, we need to track what's going into our open source projects or what's going to our proprietary software to make sure that we don't have to buy Richard Stallman a new house because we use GPL code. And there was a general movement, but there hadn't really been a catalyzing event. And so at NTIA, I was the director of cybersecurity initiatives. And the vision there was to say, what can we do to improve overall cybersecurity by bringing people together and saying, here's a shared vision of this problem that we can now be more focused on targeting. And done some work on different things. We had the great idea of saying, let's put hackers and product security teams in the same room and talk about disclosure. But for SBOM, it was such a natural fit, right? It was an idea that, still to this day, and Tom and I sort of talk about this a lot in terms of just being angry. Like, how is it that people don't know what's in their software? It just was boggling. He said, let's have that conversation. And so in 2018, we said, we're going to have a room, right? We're the government. Let's have this discussion. We brought together people who make software, people who do security services for software, and the people who use software, and say, what does transparency look like? And built out that shared vision, sort of this voluntary kumbaya approach. And then along comes SolarWinds, where everyone sort of looked around and said, oh, the thing that the security people have been talking about for a while, we don't really pay attention to how securely we build our software, has finally bit us in the ass. Right? Some software was shipped with compromises from a foreign intelligence agency, and we said, we need to get serious about this. And so the White House at the time said, here's a plan to take secure development seriously. And a lot of it was stuff that everyone should have been doing anyway. But the new thing was SBOM. So before we could say you have to have an SBOM, the government actually needed a formal definition of what an SBOM was. And so as I was helping write that executive order from 2021, a big part of the vision was saying, let's try to define an SBOM in a way so that we're all, again, building on this community work, have this shared vision of what it looks like. And so that went out into the world. The minimum elements was published. And then it sort of made sense to say, move from startup land at a tiny part of the Department of Commerce to take this project over to CISA, the cybersecurity agency in the US, where we could actually integrate it with the broader cybersecurity agenda. And so for several years, it lived there, and it still does.
That's awesome. And you alluded to the GPL, right? And the reason it's an issue is because most developers, you could argue that they assemble software as much as they write software, right?
Oh,
Because
right.
sort of 80% of the code comes from third parties.
I mean, we all know this, but having to explain, especially to policymakers or folks that are worried about financial risk, the big picture, like software is not hewn out of marble by tonsured monks on Greek islands, right? It's assembled. What's it assembled of? More software, and that stuff is more assembled out of more software. And everyone throws around different numbers, but even 97% is built on open source, but even the stuff that's not built on open source is built on other people's chunks of code.
Right. And Tom, you built NetRise really to address this problem, and it's more than just the code itself, right? There's a lot of other artifacts associated with the software. Can you kind of walk us through the approach that we've taken? And it's as if we're kind of approaching SBOMs. Is it from two different directions?
Yeah, I mean, I think just as in traditional supply chain risk management, it's not only about is this component in this thing I'm building bad or insecure or faulty. It's also about, where did it come from? How old is it? How did it get there? There's all these other characteristics around whether or not something is just good or bad. The good or bad problem is, essentially a malware problem. And what we're more interested in is what is the actual, makeup of these things. And that includes SBOMs, but SBOMs are just an artifact that, can be provided from a software supply chain security perspective. You also have, credentials, public keys, private keys, certificates, secrets, misconfigurations, binary protections. You have this litany of software supply chain artifacts that can all, either introduce risk or mitigate risk or eliminate risk in depending on what they are. And so, let's just imagine a world where you have whether if it's a firmware image or Windows application, doesn't really matter. And every component in that thing is brand new, fully updated. And let's just also imagine there's no vulnerabilities in any of those things. But then you have a set of hard-coded credentials that just allows you to log into something. So this is why it's important to take a holistic approach to software supply chain security and not just only focus on, the SBOM piece. But in terms of, the other question you asked around coming at it from both sides, we work with people who both build software and people who buy software. Those are two, the use cases are actually the same, roughly. They're in a different priority order, is the way that I kind of think about it. And what you can do with the data is also different. The things you can do with the data are more, robust if you're the people building the software. But even there, that's not always the case. If you are a particular vendor and you're relying on, tier 1 OEM suppliers for your operating system or this component or module or whatever, you essentially have the same limitations as a software consumer whenever they buy something from a third party as well. And so the key here, though, is being able to hit it from both sides is really important, because it gives us different perspectives, and it allows us to understand what are the things that people kind of care about most. And the good news is most people kind of care about the same things. Being able to identify, the most things with the most accuracy to generate the most risk so that they can make the best data-informed decision is a general consistent pattern across both sets of those constituents.
Cool. And then, Allan, what do you see as the big use cases from the government point of view? And, Tom, we'll get into it in a moment, in the private sector. But, as you were thinking about this, I mean, transparency is a great objective, right? It's a great goal, but then what do you do with it?
So first, I would say step 0 is, can you give me the basics of what's in your software? And I don't even have to look at it. I just want to know that you have the maturity to actually create this data and that you have the attention to detail to go and find it. So we think of this in economics terms, we call this an efficient signal. Having an SBOM doesn't make you secure, but if you don't have one, it's a really bad sign. So that's just step 1. Step 2 is have the data, and what I'm worried about is sort of the pull the emergency cord incident response. So we went through this with Log4j back in the end of 2021. It hit us during the holiday season. I and a bunch of my colleagues spent, a week in, families' guest rooms, hunched over our tiny little travel laptops, trying to get a handle on this. And this is one of those areas where if you just had an SBOM and threw it in the corner, well, guess what? Your job was a lot easier because this just turned into grep rather than pick up the phone and try to get someone on the other end of a medium-sized software company to say, hey, what's running in this thing? And by the way, the companies, the service providers also like this, right? No one wants to have to spend all day answering the phone. Are you affected by Log4j? Product's written in C, of course not. So you're sort of efficient on that side. Where we're starting to get is turning that data into basic use cases. So some of it's government compliance, right? Agencies have to say there are no serious vulnerabilities in this software. There's nothing from the KEV list in this software. There's nothing that's actively exploited in this. So being able to sort of routinize that and slip it into some basic tools that just scan all this data and say, can I track this? Where we're heading, and we've seen a lot of signals from folks from the White House to the new nominee for DoD CIO is saying, hey, we're going to have this data and we're going to integrate this into our existing security processes. And this gets to a little bit what Tom said, right? SBOM is nice, but it's just an artifact. There's nothing magic about it. It really is just part of the complete breakfast of, I have asset management tools. They tell me which blinking boxes I have. It makes sense to say the next step is, we'll enumerate everything that's in those blinking boxes so I can also manage that. And then we're going to get to some of the higher level functions that folks in government, I think, are excited about, which is, well, what's my overall exposure to certain open source risks? So being able to pull this data and say, what's the overall exposure? What are the frameworks, right, that I'm using as development base that I know are going to be outdated? And so this whole set of companies or all of these products over here, they're going to have to do a bunch of code refactoring, and that's going to end up costing my budget more in the next budget cycle as I look over the horizon. So you start to take data into intelligence, and then you can turn that into both action, right? This is vulnerable, fix it, and strategy, what I'm trying to plan for in the future.
Yeah, so much to unpack out of that. It's an amazing answer. But you talked about compliance, and when I think about that, and maybe Thomas, you have experience working with people on third-party risk. They're trying to measure compliance, right, as part of their assessment of risk. But of course, the software is not static, right? The compliance is kind of a point in time. Tom, how do you think about that in terms of when you're guiding people to bring the SBOM, sort of operationalize it in their environments?
Yeah. So I think Allan briefly touched on this. No one ever pushes back or argues with the concept of an asset inventory, right? Everybody understands why they're valuable. Everybody thinks it's a good idea to have one. It's critical security control number one for a reason. Those are in priority order. They're not just like randomly organized. But everybody forgets critical security control number two, which is having a software inventory. And so the first step is just to have an inventory of all of your software. And then if you can decompose that software into having SBOMs, and if you're getting them from all of your vendors, I mean, that's awesome. You're the most successful company on the planet if you have that from all of your vendors, because I don't think there's a single company that could even make that claim, which is the reason we, are in business, of course. And so from there, you have all these downstream use cases that you can now address. You have the incident response use cases that Allan mentioned, which are obviously more reactive. Then you have threat hunting use cases that can be more proactive. So, just because all of your vendors or even your own internally developed software, tells you that they don't have Log4j, they don't have outdated versions of OpenSSL, they don't have 15-year-old versions of BusyBox, whatever it is. Now you can go and, trust but verify. So it's always been very strange to me, the friction that we still feel sometimes around SBOM. Trust but verify is just like the three most obvious words in cybersecurity. And I think that, I really believe that there is like this, honestly, almost like a psychological phenomenon with SBOM, where people are nervous around, what they're going to find, and are they going to be called to the carpet on certain things. And my message to those people is everyone has this problem. Everyone. There's no one that doesn't have this problem. Think of the biggest technology companies on planet Earth and the smallest, one app software producer. Every single company has this issue. And I think the faster we recognize that, the faster we just decide that this level of transparency is not a problem. And unfortunately, there are certain like regulatory and compliance frameworks and standards that, people get nervous about. But once again, if everyone has the problem, what has to change? Are we all just going to stop buying software? No. The standard at which we allow ourselves to utilize is what needs to probably change. But the problem is those standards and frameworks were built without the data in advance. They were built before we had all the data. Well, now we have data. So we should probably put, in a super optimistic world, we would put the entire world on a POAM, where we would say, 18 months from now, guys, no end of life software in anything. And 24 months from now, no vulnerabilities older than a decade old or whatever it is. But the good news is, and this has always been one of my points of contention with sometimes how the government has handled this, is the government has the biggest stick on planet Earth. They buy the most software, they have the most power, they have the most authority to do whatever they want. Just look around. Who thinks that that's not true? And yet there's this apprehension to utilize that power. And if it was only to benefit themselves, you can understand how that kind of makes a bit more sense. But this data can be shared with everyone. So all of this data that the federal government would be able to collect and procure could then be used to make the private sector more secure and resilient and robust as well. So there's a killing many birds with one stone here thing when you're doing this from a third party perspective. To circle back briefly, some of the other downstream use cases of the software inventory, I mentioned incident response, threat hunting. You also have vulnerability management, and you have third party risk. You have GRC, you have a number of other ones as well, but those are probably the top 5 or 6. The third party risk one is just enormous. We have been relying on, dare I say it, security theater in third party risk for a very long time. You're relying on a questionnaire and self-attestation that is not, it was good enough because it's all there was, right? And so I'm not criticizing the fact that that's what we were doing. It's all there was to do. for a long time. But we have to be able to adjust. We have to be able to be agile. And whenever we are presented with a net new way to generate data that allows us to make better and more informed risk decisions, we should be open to that. And that's what many of our customers are doing precisely.
Yeah. If you're doing something in security in 2025 and it's not built explicitly for automation, you're doing it wrong, right? This is the only way we're going to get ahead of the security challenges that we face as organizations and at a very real national security issue is what do defenders have? They have the power of automated tools. We need to use more of them. We need to build them better. We need to get them to talk to each other more. And then also there's this idea of sharing data that Tom mentioned. And I don't think anyone is proposing that SBOMs, relatively few people are proposing that we make all the SBOMs public, right? That's not what we're trying to do here, but it is saying, hey, as we're collaborating with each other, if I'm generating data for a government customer, great. Now it's a lot easier for me to provide it to all of my private sector customers as well. And now I can scale, and now I can bring something to the table that maybe my competitors don't have.
Exactly.
And so how's the SBOM developing, right? There's been a new request for comments by CISA on an updated minimum elements, of the SBOM. What's kind of both of you, or really for both of you, what's your views on what CISA is proposing and where we think that could go perhaps even further?
Well, first I'll admit I wrote them. So obviously I think they're in the right direction. And the reason why we felt that they needed to be there was the original minimum elements were a necessary part, right? Can't ask for an SBOM if you don't tell people what an SBOM is. And those minimum elements were written in 2021, where there were two things. One, the technology was not quite mature. And two, as Tom alluded to, there were a lot of people that really didn't want to do this. It is kind of nice that it's no longer as controversial as it used to be. I think people finally said, of course, yes, I have a list of ingredients in food. That's a good thing. List of ingredients in software is a good thing as well. And what we needed was to sort of, one, move forward on some of the things that I think we at NTIA at the time intentionally pulled a punch, which is say, what's an SBOM? Well, you must have the top level dependencies. And it'd be great if you could have more. And that was sort of a nod to the fact that industry was reluctant and that data was often hard to get, right? My device is built on a proprietary real-time operating system. That vendor is going to take a year or two to be able to pull that out. And so it was always meant to be temporary or as a starting point. And then the second piece was sort of looking at, so in addition to saying an SBOM now has to have everything in it, trying to clarify some details, right? Give us as many identifiers as you have the hash if you have access to the code, and try to clarify some of the definitions to align with what we felt the tools were able to do. Industry responded. There's some interesting comments. I know NetRise shared their opinions, and so I'm looking forward to Tom saying this is where Allan was just wildly wrong about the technology.
What I was most optimistic about when I saw the request for comment was the number and quality of the feedback that was in there. And anytime the government asks for an opinion, you're going to get a wide ranging set of them. Some of them are rational and some of them are not. But there was a handful in there, and I remember reading a couple of them, and I was like, "Wow, that's a really good idea." And I hadn't even thought of some of those ideas, and I was like, "I'm not going to change what we're saying. I'm going to let that person, keep their flowers because that's a really good idea." And so, I think that to play like a devil's advocate against almost myself. We had a hard time getting people to even adhere to the original minimum standards. in fact, something that we talk about all the time is the concept of known unknowns, where that was a required field. I've never met anybody who ever did it. We do it. We include all the things, the way I would always describe it in the context of the ingredients list was, this is the natural flavors, this is the natural flavors catch-all, where if we don't know what it is, we're just going to call it that. But like the more specificity that is clearly coming down the line, I think is actually, even though it's more, I think it's better. Because when you just tell people exactly what it is you want to do, they can decide to do it or not do it. That's one thing. But you can't make the lack of clarity argument anymore, at least. And just because we have a minimum set of requirements or whatever coming from CISA, that's not necessarily, a law, or all of that doesn't have to be adopted as part of some compliance framework or standard or anything. But to me, it's always been it's been one of the things that we've used to align how we think about these things. We've always done more than what was in the minimum standard. I think that's a good, rule of thumb, generally speaking. But what I liked is, like I said, number one, having more people provide pretty mature and robust feedback, and mostly mature. And number two, just more clarity around the specifics.
Cool. I mean, I want to just be mindful of time, because I think this is going to stop in about 3 minutes. So one thing we haven't talked about, Tom, is where the content from the SBOM comes from, right? And I know we have a view that SBOMs derive from binary analysis of the binary code can be more comprehensive and accurate than that from the source code. Can you address that in like 2 minutes?
Sure. So fundamentally, the impetus for this company started from, my time at Department of Energy, my time at Silence, doing these like assessments and device teardowns and things like that. And we're not advocating that people don't do source code security and source code analysis. That's not what we're saying. What we are saying is, if you want to understand the risk of something, you should look at the thing as it's built, and not at the thing as it's deconstructed. Like you would never go to a job site and see, a building in all of its pieces and ingredients and go, that building is going to be secure, right? Like that wouldn't make any sense. Like you got to know what it looks like when it's built to understand, like, are there vulnerabilities? Are there, is this wall too high? Is the door strong enough? Like whatever. And so making a determination on software that is not the thing that actual customers are buying, using, and installing is just not going to give you an accurate representation of the risk. I mean, it's kind of that simple. And so that's where that thesis comes from. Now it's much harder. It's a much harder problem. I mean, we operate on a zero knowledge, black box, mentality. Now, sure, we work with some of the OEMs and everything, and that gets us, less black box visibility. But on average, we're just working totally blind. And so being able to go in there and figure out like the answers to the test in that approach is just a lot harder. But it's the only way to give an accurate representation of what's actually there and what's not there. But to say it again, we're not advocating people stop doing source code analysis.
Understood. And thanks. As we wrap up, I'm just going to ask you guys for just a quick hits from each of you. What's your biggest hot take for the future of the SBOM and software supply chain security?
My take is there are a lot of people who are now in positions of power, either in companies or governments, who say this is an obvious idea. And so it's going to come at you in more and more corners. it's good security, but now it's just going to be a requirement.
I don't know how much of a hot take this is, but we are seeing very large corporations include in their contracts that not only SBOMs being required, but the data from SBOMs. Like, we don't want end-of-life components in our things. We don't want components that have KEVs, like whatever it is. And I don't think that hasn't matriculated across the entire market yet, but I'm sure there's some people who are going to hear this, and that might be a hot take for them. It should be a lukewarm take because it's already happening. And, to Allan's prior point, the artist formerly known as the DoD, the Department of War incoming CIO, is making SBOMs for third-party stuff a priority. It's happening. And the DoW does not buy software that only the DoW buys. So if you're not ready, you better get ready.
So everybody's got to get on the bus now.
There's lots of seats.
Awesome. Allan Friedman, Tom Pace, thank you so much for joining me today for a fantastic conversation. And I know there's loads more to come from both of you. Thanks again.
Thanks, Gary.
Thanks a lot.
Want to learn more about NetRise? Visit us at netrise.io. Follow us on LinkedIn, subscribe to our YouTube channel, or join our mailing list.